The sun dipped low over Dust Haven, that quiet little town tucked between the red cliffs and the endless plains. Its streets, once alive with the laughter of ranch hands and the jingle of spurs, now lay quiet beneath the dying glow of evening. Sheriff William Brody stood on the steps of his office, hat tilted against the fading light, and felt the weight of 30 years pressing down on his shoulders. Retirement was just days away, a word that should have sounded like peace, but instead it echoed like a hollow promise. The badge on his chest gleamed faintly, dulled by time and sweat. It wasn't just a symbol of law. It was a burden he'd carried through gunfights, heartbreak, and too many funerals. Every dent in that tin star told a story, but the one story he could never finish was the one that haunted him most, the cold case of Elena Moore. 10 years ago, she'd vanished without a trace. Brody had chased every lead until it led nowhere but deep down. He'd always suspected the rot ran deeper into the veins of the town itself now. As the days dwindled, the ghosts of his failures whispered louder. He still wore his late wife's ring on a chain beneath his shirt. Clara had been his anchor, the only one who could talk him down from the edge of obsession. Since her passing, the silence of his home felt unbearable. Sometimes he'd catch himself talking to her picture, about the case, about the town, about whether he'd done enough. But the picture never answered back, only reflected the lines that age and guilt had carved into his face that evening. Deputy Mills, young, eager, and untested, burst into the office, his face pale beneath the brim of his hat. "Sheriff, you'd better see this." Brody followed him to the evidence room where a stack of old files had been disturbed. On top sat a new envelope unmarked, its contents chillingly familiar. A photograph of Elena Moore, smiling, dated only a week ago. Brody's gut clenched. The case he thought buried had come clawing back to life. Someone out there wanted him to remember, wanted him back in the game for the first time in years. The sheriff's old instincts sparked awake. He could feel it. The town wasn't as quiet as it looked. Behind the saloons and church bells, behind the faces that greeted him with polite smiles, something poisonous was moving again. The same kind of corruption he'd once sworn to uproot was still festering, only smarter, meaner. Better hidden then came word of a new gang riding through the outskirts, a ruthless crew known for torching ranches and running contraband across the border. Their leader, a man called Crane, was said to have half the county bought and paid for. Brody had hoped his successor could deal with it. But as the reports came in, beatings, disappearances, threats, he realized this storm wasn't going to wait for the next lawman. That night, rain began to fall, steady and cold. Brody sat alone in his office, staring at his reflection in the dark window. The town he'd given his life to was changing, growing harder, crueler. Maybe the fight had changed too, but some things still needed settling before he could hang up his badge for good. He thought of Clara again, of her voice saying softly, "You always had to see things through your will." He reached into his desk drawer and pulled out his revolver, checked the chambers, then slid it back into his holster. The storm outside grew louder, rolling like distant thunder over the plains. Retirement would have to wait. Dusthaven still needed its sheriff one last time. The night had barely broken into dawn when Sheriff William Brody found himself back where it all began, knee-deep in the ghosts of a case that refused to die. The envelope that appeared days earlier had ignited a fire in him, one he thought had burned out long ago. That photograph of Elena Moore, smiling like she'd never vanished, had been no coincidence. Someone wanted him to see it, and someone wanted him silenced. He spread the files across his worn desk, the same oak surface that had seen 30 years of justice and compromise. Coffee steamed beside him as he traced the familiar lines of handwriting, the ink faded but the memory sharp. Then he found it, a report that had never been filed properly, hidden beneath false signatures. It mentioned a piece of bone found near the riverbank years ago, dismissed as animal remains by the town coroner. But Brody remembered arguing that point, remembered the bruises on the victim's brother when he'd questioned him. Too harshly, something in that small note pulled at his instincts. He called the state office, requesting a new analysis they sent Semyoneto UDR. Lena Petrova stepped into Dusthaven like a gust of clean wind in a stale room. Tall, composed, with sharp gray eyes that missed nothing, she looked more like a scholar than someone who spent her days among bones. She spoke softly, but with a kind of certainty that could silence a room. Brody wasn't sure what he expected, but it wasn't her, a woman who could look at death and still carry gentleness in her voice when she examined the remains under her portable light kit, her brow furrowed. "This isn't animal," she murmured. "The fractures. They're deliberate. Someone wanted this body to disappear, but not before sending a message." Brody felt the old ache in his chest tighten. It wasn't just a cold case anymore. It was murder, and the murderer was still out there. Word spread fast in Dusthaven. Brody's inquiries stirred the hornet's nest he'd always known existed but couldn't touch. Landowners, old money, and the same men who'd raised toasts at his wife's funeral suddenly wanted meetings. The mayor called it reckless to reopen the case. The bank threatened to cut funding for the sheriff's office. And then came the threats. Anonymous calls, headlights outside his home at night, a dead crow nailed to his office door. Still, Brody didn't flinch. He'd been through worse storms. "If they want me scared," he said. They should have come 30 years earlier. Lena, against the sheriff's orders, refused to leave town. She'd seen what he was fighting, not just criminals, but the corruption that had wrapped its roots around every corner of Dusthaven. One night, as rain hammered against the window, she told him, "You've carried this weight too long alone, Sheriff. Maybe it's time someone else shared it." Her voice was calm, but her eyes burned with something more, not pity, but respect. Maybe even something deeper. Together, they began piecing together the puzzle. The bone she'd examined matched Elena Moore's DNA, but there was more, residue from a type of industrial solvent used only in one of the county's mines. A mine owned by none other than Mayor Hal Crandall, the man who'd built his fortune and power on Dusthaven's soil. Brody felt fury rise in him, not the hot kind, but the steady, righteous burn that comes when a man realizes the truth he's feared was right all along. The corruption wasn't hidden in shadows. It was sitting in church pews and shaking hands at town fairs. As Lena packed up her tools, Brody stared out at the horizon, the clouds rolling heavy with thunder. "You should leave town," he said quietly. "This isn't your fight." She met his gaze. Unwavering, "It is now," and in that moment, amid the storm, the danger, and the weight of everything left undone, Brody knew two things for certain. The past wasn't finished with him yet, and neither was justice. Retirement could wait. The reckoning had just begun. The next few days in Dusthaven were a blur of dust, rain, and discovery. Sheriff Brody and Dr. Lena Petrova worked side by side, sifting through the wreckage of old lies and buried truths. They were two people from different worlds, one shaped by law and loss, the other by science and solitude, yet both were driven by the same fire to uncover what others wanted forgotten. Brody had spent his life serving justice in a place where justice often meant compromise. He'd learned to hide behind silence, to wear his authority like armor. But Lena didn't flinch from that armor. She saw through it. Her questions cut cleanly, her eyes unblinking as she studied him as much as the evidence. One evening, while they sorted files in his office, she said quietly, "You don't really want to retire, do you?" Brody didn't answer right away. He just stared at the photograph on his desk, his late wife Clara, smiling on their wedding day. "Once got nothing to do with it," he finally muttered. "Just figured I'd earned the right to stop fighting." Lena's reply was calm but sharp. "You're still fighting. You just changed what you're fighting for. That truth hit him harder than a bullet. For years, Brody had thought he was holding the line for others. Now he realized he'd been holding it for himself, afraid that if he let go, there'd be nothing left of the man behind the badge. They spent long nights at the sheriff's office, tracing connections between the old disappearance and the new crimes. Sometimes Lena would hum softly while she worked, a habit she said helped her think. Brody found the sound strangely comforting. It filled the empty spaces the way Clara's laughter used tonight. As thunder cracked outside, Lena handed him a mug of coffee, black, strong, no sugar. "You look like a man who's been carrying too many ghosts," she said. He gave a faint smile. "And you look like a woman who's seen too many bones." She laughed, the first real laugh he'd heard in weeks. It caught him off guard, and before he could stop himself, he laughed too. The sound was rough and unfamiliar, like something he hadn't used in years. For a moment, the room didn't feel so heavy. That night marked a change. Between the grim tasks and the threats hanging over them, something warm began to take root. Not romance, not yet, but understanding. They shared stories over late-night coffee. Lena spoke of her homeland, of the war that had taken her family. Brody spoke of Clara, of the badge, of the years that had bled into one another. Their pain was different, but their loneliness was the same. The next morning, when they visited the old mine site, Brody noticed the way Lena scanned the ground, precise, careful, unafraid. "You don't spook easy," he said. "I work with the dead." She replied with a half-smile. "The living are much scarier." He didn't say it out loud, but he agreed. And as he watched her kneel in the dirt, brushing soil away from a fragment of bone, he realized how much he admired her courage, not the loud kind, but the quiet, enduring sort that refuses to give in. Back in town, the tension between them had softened. They began finishing each other's sentences, reading each other's thoughts. Brody found himself waiting for her to walk through the door every morning. She had a way of bringing light into rooms he'd long accepted as dark for the first time in years. Sheriff Brody felt something that resembled hope. Not because the case was close to solved, it wasn't, but because in Lena, he'd found proof that even after decades of loss, a man could still feel alive. It wasn't love yet, but it was a spark in the ashes, and that was enough to keep him fighting. The storm that had lingered over Dusthaven finally broke, not with rain, but with revelation. After weeks of relentless digging, Sheriff Brody and Dr. Lena Petrova had uncovered the rot beneath the town's calm surface. What began as a cold case had unraveled into a web of deceit, corruption, and murder. A network that reached from the mayor's office to the very deputies Brody once trusted. It started with a single piece of evidence, a blood-stained ledger Lena found sealed behind the walls of the abandoned mine office. The entries inside tied shipments of illegal contraband to the same mine that had once employed Elena Moore. Every name, every transaction, every payoff was there, and near the top sat Mayor Hal Crandall's signature. It was the smoking gun Brody had chased for over a decade. The moment he read that name, Brody felt something in him shift, part fury, part release. All those years of suspicion, all the whispers of cover-ups and lost files. They hadn't been paranoia, they'd been prophecy. He and Lena brought the evidence to the state marshal's office, but Crandall's reach ran deep. Within hours, men loyal to the mayor descended on Dusthaven, intent on silencing the sheriff before dawn. The final confrontation came not in the courthouse or saloon, but at the old rail yard, a fitting place for endings. The night was thick with fog, the air sharp with the scent of oil and iron. Brody stood beside Lena, revolver drawn, every muscle taut with purpose. Crandall emerged from the shadows, flanked by hired guns. "You should have walked away, Will," the mayor sneered. "You were supposed to be done." Brody's voice was calm, steady as a heartbeat. "You don't get to decide when justice retires." The gunfire came fast, flashes of orange tearing through the fog. Brody moved like instinct, like memory. Lena ducked behind a rail cart, covering him with precise shots from the pistol he'd taught her to use. In the chaos, one of Crandall's men caught Brody across the shoulder, but he didn't stop. He pressed forward, every breath carrying the weight of 30 years of Clara's memory, of Elena Moore's ghost, of every promise he'd ever made to this town when the smoke cleared. Crandall lay wounded, the ledger clutched in Brody's hand. Sirens wailed in the distance. The marshals were coming. Justice, at long last, had arrived by dawn. The arrests were made. The town that had turned a blind eye could no longer look away. Brody stood on the courthouse steps, his arm bandaged, watching as Crandall and his men were led away in chains. Lena stood beside him, eyes steady, lips pressed into a proud, quiet smile. The papers called it the redemption of Dusthaven. For the people, it was closure. For Brody, it was something deeper. The cold case that had haunted him, the ghosts that had whispered from the shadows, were finally laid to rest. Elena Moore's remains were buried on the hill overlooking the plains, and for the first time in years, Brody attended a funeral without the weight of failure when the town gathered that evening to honor him. Brody stood before them not as a sheriff, but as a man who had finally made peace with his own past. The applause felt distant. What drew his attention wasn't the crowd or the ceremony. It was Lena, standing a few steps away, her hair catching the sunset's last light as they walked away from the crowd. Lena said softly, "You did it." "Sheriff," Brody shook his head. "We did it." There was a pause, the kind that held 1,000 unspoken things. Then, with a quiet smile, Lena reached for his hand for a man who'd spent a lifetime alone. The gesture felt like dawn after an endless night. Brody looked out across Dusthaven, a town reborn, a past redeemed, and realized something he hadn't dared to believe in years. His story wasn't over. Justice had given him peace, but Lena had given him a future. The sun rose gently over Dusthaven, washing the town in soft amber light. For the first time in decades, Sheriff William Brody woke not to the sound of duty calling, but to silence, a silence that felt peaceful instead of empty. The badge that had once rested over his heart now lay in a wooden box on the table beside his bed. Its edges were worn smooth, the metal dulled with years of service. It was no longer a burden but a relic, a piece of a life well fought and finally laid to rest across the room. Lena stirred awake, the morning light brushing her face. She looked at him with a faint, knowing smile. "You're not used to waking up without the world waiting for you, are you?" She teased gently. Brody chuckled, the sound low and genuine. "World's still out there," he said. "I'm just learning it can turn without me for once." The week since the case's end had been a quiet transformation. The town had rebuilt its sense of trust, the people nodding to Brody with newfound respect, not as a sheriff, but as a man who'd given them back their home. Yet, what surprised him most wasn't the town's gratitude. It was how easily he'd learned to live without his badge. The weight that had once defined him was gone, replaced by something lighter, the steady warmth of Lena's companionship. They spent their mornings walking the ridge beyond town, where the grass swayed against the wind and the horizon stretched endless. Brody found comfort in the rhythm of those walks, in Lena's quiet laughter, in the stories she told of distant places, in the way her hand fit so naturally into his. He'd thought love belonged only to his past, buried with Clara, but Lena had shown him that love wasn't a replacement. It was a continuation. It didn't erase what came before. It honored it by allowing life to move forward. Sometimes they spoke of the past, of Clara, of Lena's lost family, and sometimes they didn't speak at all. It was in those silences that Brody felt the healing. Most grief, he realized, wasn't something a man overcame. It was something he learned to live beside, and with Lena, that ache became softer, Like an old scar that no longer hurt when touched one evening, they sat by the river bank. The same river that had once held the secrets of Elena Moore's case now. It shimmered under the setting sun, calm and golden. Lena leaned against him, her head resting on his shoulder. "You ever wonder what comes next?" she asked softly. Brody smiled faintly. "All the time," he admitted. "But maybe that's the point. Maybe it's not about knowing, it's about being willing to find out." She reached for his hand, threading her fingers through his. "Then we'll find out together." He looked at her and saw in her eyes not just compassion, but possibility. It struck him that the best parts of his life weren't behind him, as he'd long believed, but right here, unfolding in front of him the next morning. They packed his old truck with little more than a duffel bag, Lena's travel journals, and a map folded neatly on the dash. The road stretched ahead, open and endless. Dust Haven faded in the rearview mirror, not as something left behind, but as something completed as the truck rolled over the horizon. Brody reached across the seat and took Lena's hand. "Never thought I'd see another beginning," he said quietly. She smiled. "You didn't see it. Well, you built it." The wind rushed through the open window, carrying with it the scent of rain and wildflowers. Ahead of them, the land spread wide and bright, an unwritten page waiting for their story. For William Brody, once the weary sheriff of a haunted town, the future no longer felt like a burden. It felt like a promise, and beside Lena, he was finally ready to live it.